DC and Marvel. When I say these two words, I'm sure one thing comes to mind: superheroes. Now, superheroes of course began as just part of comic book stories, but then became giant Hollywood franchises, bringing in billions of dollars every single year, whilst creating giant A-list celebrities in the process. And what could be cooler than seeing these characters on the big screen and then being able to play as them yourself? Well, this is where video games come in. In the current day, you have giant AAA games being produced by billion-dollar companies, some amazing, some not so amazing. But it wasn't always like this, and you might be surprised to see how superhero games have evolved over the years. From tiny 2D games to weird flash games, it's safe to say that developers have tried to squeeze out every little ounce of content they could from these characters, and for good reason. It makes a shit ton of money. By using globally recognized superheroes, players instantly get a sense of familiarity, seeing the characters they've watched their entire childhood in a playable world. And I mean, who doesn't want to go around destroying people as Batman? Also, if you like my content, please like and subscribe. It means a lot more than you think. But to see where all of this started, we need to go back a few years to 1979. At this time, the Atari 2600 was the main console that gamers were playing, and we were going into the golden age of arcade gaming. This is when the first ever actual superhero game was developed, Superman, for the Atari 2600, created by John Dunn. This game follows Superman and Clark Kent, or at least what kind of looks like him, flying around a 2D version of Metropolis, looking for pieces of a broken bridge that Lex Luthor has destroyed. You have to capture him and return back to work at the Daily Planet. The game doesn't track your success through points, but through how long it takes you to complete the tasks, which was quite different compared to most Atari games at the time, and which mainly measured a score that the player continued to receive throughout the game. Superman for the Atari has a classic arcade look, with the whole game comprised of a few pixels on a small screen, and was made before side-scrolling was even a thing, so the screen just changes every few minutes when the player goes off it. However, despite the simple graphics, the game actually has some interesting mechanics. For example, there's a feature where the player can change from Superman to Clark Kent and vice versa by going into these telephone boxes, and also has quite a large world that can be explored freely. I think this game was a bit before its time, as it showed features such as a mission-based structure, licensed superhero character, and, as previously mentioned, an open world design. And what this did do is show that games can simulate a character's abilities, for example flying and changing clothes, build a world rather than just a binary challenge that the player needs to complete, whilst also telling a story through gameplay, even if it's a simple one. So in some ways, we have this to thank for many games that came after. Now, with DC's Superman for the Atari being released, Marvel decided they wanted a piece of the action, which led to their attempt at the video game world, with Spider-Man in 1982 also on the Atari. This follows a very simple gameplay style where the player controls Spider-Man as he climbs a building. To be fair, this was at a time where developers were still trying to figure out what video games could even be, and although the game was simple, it became quite competitive, making it a tense experience at times. The entire game consists of one objective: get to the top of a skyscraper to defuse a bomb that has been planted by the Green Goblin. The core mechanics consist of shooting webs to latch onto the skyscraper and pull yourself higher, but you do have to watch out for enemies and obstacles that will knock you down, such as the Green Goblin himself, as well as his henchmen. Each new screen consists of a new section of building, each with an increased difficulty and different layout, and eventually you get to the top where you must disarm the bombs before the time runs out. Similar to Superman and most other Atari games, visuals are very abstract. Spider-Man, the main character of the game, by the way, is a very small, blocky figure, and the building itself is represented by a few vertical lines. But of course, I wouldn't hold this against the developers, as this was the early 80s and on one of the first consoles to ever exist. So I wouldn't be expecting something made in Unreal Engine 5. This game's scoring system is the same as most Atari games, with the main aim of the game to try and get the highest score possible, but although it was like many others, it did technically introduce the first ever swinging mechanic in a Spider-Man game, despite it being very basic, and also showed DC that Marvel could get involved with the gaming industry with their own products. But with the 80s now in full swing, some new and improved game systems were being released, such as the NES and Sega Master System. With these came many more superhero games, now being able to become much more sophisticated and explore the boundaries of what a superhero game could actually be. And one of the first of which to do this is the Incredible Hulk, released on the Sega in 1985. This game put a bit of a twist on the arcade-style superhero game and led into a more strategic and puzzle-like experience. The game starts with Bruce Banner turning into Hulk in a short little animation, and now you must fight hordes of enemies through this facility that you find yourself in. There are some actually quite interesting features in this game that weren't really seen before when looking at previous superhero games. First of all, this was now a side-scrolling game, meaning the screen wasn't changing every 30 seconds. And then there's also the fighting. The Hulk in this game has a variety of attacks that he can use against enemies, from just normal punching to creating shockwaves with his claps, not them type of claps. And the enemies that he is fighting actually change with each level and have decent variation to them, which keeps the game interesting. And there's also a boss battle at the end of each level, which features some already known Marvel villains such as Rhino, Tyrannus, and even a giant brain, which I'm not familiar with, but looks cool. And although you play the majority of the game as the Hulk, if you take too much damage or run out of energy, you will actually revert back to Bruce Banner, and this completely changes up how you need to play the game, whilst also introducing the idea of power conservation. When in Hulk form, you just push through and fight everything, whereas when playing as Bruce, you need to hide and try and avoid enemies and get through levels without conflict until you can transform into the Hulk again. Quite an interesting mechanic iconic, especially for just an arcade game that's using Marvel's products. The objectives are pretty simple though. Defeat enemies, rescue civilians, and get to the end. You can definitely tell this game came out in the 80s as well, not just because it's an arcade game, but also because of the bright and vibrant yet simple sprites used. And speaking of sprites, we actually get a larger, more detailed main character now, instead of just a few blocks that resemble Superman. But a few years later, Spider-Man and Captain America in Doctor Doom's Revenge was released in 1987. God, I don't know what it was with these old games and having such long titles. But this game, like the Hulk, features some storytelling through static pictures which resemble the comics and take place in a scenario where Doctor Doom is threatening the world and Spider-Man and Captain America team up to take him down. The player is able to switch between each character, and they both have different attack methods. Spider-Man uses his agility and web attacks, and Captain America uses his strength and iconic shield. The game has you solve puzzles using each character, and sometimes a combination of the two, with also an added sense of urgency because of a timer that's ticking down just to make you sweat a little bit. Of course, this game is very similar to the Hulk with its side-scrolling arcade style, but now having two Marvel heroes was pretty cool and added a variety, as well as another character that we had not seen yet within a video game. And this was actually the first ever team-based superhero game, so that's pretty cool. Now we move on to the 1990s. Players were still gaming on the NES and Sega Genesis, however some even newer consoles were being released that definitely created ripples throughout the market and would go on to surpass the previous gaming devices. Sony's PlayStation was released in 1994, followed by the Nintendo 64 in 1996, which meant all games, including superhero ones, now had much more room to grow and develop into much better and complex titles. Still on the NES in 1992 was one of the first Batman games to be released, Batman Returns, which was based off the movie that was also released that year. In this title, you play as, surprise surprise, Batman, and need to clean up the streets of Gotham, taking on the forces of Penguin. This game is very similar to the previous ones mentioned, but to be fair, there are only so many ways you can make an arcade superhero game, and a lot of them are just reskins with different mechanics based on the character. But anyways, you can punch, kick, and use combos to defeat thugs, as well as batarangs and other tools. You also get to throw enemies into walls and windows, which is pretty fun, and there are some boss battles which break up the levels. This is also the first of the superhero games to include some driving sequences, which, now that I think about it, actually, why would the others? Batman's the only one with a Batmobile. But nevertheless, it's still very cool. The style, you can tell, has been heavily inspired by the Tim Burton movie, with its dark and moody visuals, with its atmospheric music to really emphasize the gritty tone, making it a lot more of a cinematic experience compared to the other games we've seen so far. So no wonder it's seen as one of the best superhero games on the NES. But now it's time to move on to the new consoles of this decade, with Superman 64 on, you guessed it, the Nintendo 64. This was the first ever attempt at bringing a superhero game to a 3D world, and it was somewhat successful. This is probably one of the most infamous superhero games out there, just for how high it aimed, but actually became a symbol of how badly things can go wrong in early 3D game design. The basic premise of the game is that Lex Luthor has trapped Superman in a virtual version of Metropolis, forcing him to complete a series of trials. Not much else to it really. Most of the game is spent flying around completing flight challenges, which is where most people had bad opinions, as the controls were very sluggish and imprecise, which has a lot more of an impact when in a 3D world compared to a 2D one. There are also some other missions that feature basic fighting against enemies with objectives like protecting civilians, carrying objects, and solving simple tasks. And there's also a kryptonite mechanic where areas filled with fog drains your health, which isn't really that good because it makes you rush rather than slow down and explore. And this was actually made into a joke by everyone, saying it hides how little there is to see. However, I do see why they included this feature, as without it you would just play as a pretty much invincible character, which in a game sense is not very fun at all. This game was cool though, as it brought a completely new style to the superhero genre. However, as previously mentioned, there is very minimal detail within the virtual Metropolis, and compared to other N64 games that were out at the time, like The Legend of Zelda, Superman 64 falls very short, and in fact, this game is often cited as one of the worst superhero games of all time. But with that, we have now left the 20th century behind and are now in the iconic 2000s. The first game to come out in this era was Spider-Man on the PlayStation, N64 and Microsoft Windows. Yeah, PC gaming was now also a thing. Spider-Man definitely revolutionized the superhero gaming genre and raised the roof for what a superhero game could be. First of all, the main character is always talking and cracking jokes, making him feel like a real person.
Mind if I drop in?
He also relies on movement and is very agile, as he should be. Instead of trying to force him into a generic action template like many games prior did, the developers built the game around him, specifically his speed, verticality, and charming personality. The biggest leap forward was definitely the web swinging system, and this came a long way from the simple 2D webs we saw earlier, and you can now build momentum as you swing and can use other forms of movement like zipping forward and climbing walls, making it feel effortless and actually fun. The map design was also built to support this, and pretty much all the game takes place on the top of rooftops, with the streets below snow covered by fog. Although it was not fully open world, it made the player feel like they had a lot more freedom and area to explore compared to the other superhero games, like Superman 64. And it's safe to say development didn't stop there, as the success brought on Spider-Man 2 and the Ultimate Spider-Man in the next few years, and with the release of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, there was even more that developers could do with these games. And soon after came Marvel Ultimate Alliance in 2006, a game that decided to not just focus on playing as one or two superheroes, but a whole team of them. This was one of the first superhero games playable on the iconic Xbox 360. It blended the RPG genre with comic book storytelling and team-based gameplay. The game allows you to control a team of 4 heroes from a very large list, and in this list are Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Wolverine, Thor, Mr. Fantastic, The Thing, Human Torch, Invisible Woman, Storm, Colossus, Iceman, Moon Knight, Deadpool, Elektra, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Miss Marvel, Silver Surfer, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Ghost Rider, Blade, and Nick Fury. This game basically plays like a beat-em-up RPG, with each character having their own abilities based off the comics. Thor can shoot lightning, Wolverine has his claws, you get the gist. This game actually excels in its team aspect, with things like bonuses, where certain character combinations have buffs, for example having all Avengers or X-Men on a team, and also includes combination attacks between multiple heroes. Unlike previous superhero games, this one actually includes leveling up progression, which allows the player to improve the strength and health of each individual hero when playing with them, which just adds a little bit of something extra to the gameplay. Now, each part of the game is divided into different Marvel scenarios from the comics. Many you'll recognise, and as the story progresses, there are multiple different choices the player can make, which have different outcomes, making for an interesting and nuanced experience, which is the first we've seen this in the genre, and showed that the limits of superhero games were constantly being tested with these new consoles. Another quick little mention is the Iron Man games on the PlayStation, which I personally loved playing when I was younger. But now we move on to DC, where they released probably the best superhero game ever, and one that definitely changed the genre, going on to become one of the most highly rated game franchises ever, as well as Batman Begins in 2005. Just wanted to throw that in there, as that was the first ever Batman game I played, and God knows as a kid I was obsessed with everything Batman related. But this amazing development was Batman Arkham Asylum, released in 2006, and this truly made players feel like they were actually Batman whilst playing. The game takes place entirely within Arkham Asylum, a high security facility for Gotham's most dangerous criminals, and the core gameplay is built around 3 main systems: combat, stealth, and investigation. The combat system, often referred to as free flow combat, was based on rhythm and timing rather than button mashing. Players can attack, counter, and chain moves together to build combos. As you progress, more moves become available, allowing you to disarm enemies and perform takedowns. The stealth or predator gameplay is another major component, and Batman uses the environment to his advantage, taking down enemies silently from above or behind using gargoyles, vents, and shadows to be able to move unseen. Enemies also react dynamically, becoming more cautious and nervous as their numbers decrease. And there's also a detective mode where players need to find clues to progress with the story, and there's a very interesting addition which breaks up the other gameplay aspects. And with this great success, we come to the end of the 2000s and into the 2010s and the current day with the 2020s. Now the gaming industry is giant and millions are being poured into the development of AAA games. The Batman Arkham series now has multiple games, and a few adaptations have been made, such as a Telltale Batman game that focuses just on the story aspect, which is very different compared to the other games released. Marvel has responded with, you guessed it, another Spider-Man game in 2018. I feel like this video could just be called How Many Batman and Spider-Man Games Have DC and Marvel Made? However, in this game, the web swinger mechanics are second to none, and amazing AAA graphics that contested with the dominant figure that were the Arkham games. There are also some fighter-style games such as Injustice, which takes inspiration from Mortal Kombat and adapts it into a superhero version, as well as an Avengers game, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Suicide Squad. However, all of these titles have not really left much of an impact on the industry, despite the fact that a lot of money was poured into them and having great studios developing them. There is also a sequel to the first new edition of the Spider-Man game, which was also well received and showed some old characters in a completely new light, which was very interesting to see. But apart from that, there hasn't really been many other significant superhero games that have been released, or ones that I have even played, if I'm being honest. But that was the entire evolution of the superhero game industry, and I think it was very interesting to go through and see it all. Let me know in the comments if there are any games that were mentioned that you have played and loved growing up, and also some that I have missed that you think should be included.